It started with the faint sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. At first, I dismissed it as simply the wind or a stray animal, but as the nights wore on, the footsteps became more persistent, more deliberate. I would lie awake, heart pounding, straining to catch even the slightest movement beyond the thin pane of glass that separated me from the darkness. My neighbor, Timothy, had always been a bit of an enigma. He kept to himself, rarely venturing out except to retrieve his mail or tend to his unkempt yard. Occasionally, I would catch him staring out of his window, his gaze seemingly fixed on my home. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid, but the uneasy feeling never quite went away. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft scratch at the window. Instinctively, I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, ever so slowly, I turned my head and peered into the inky blackness beyond the glass. At first I saw nothing, but then a shadowy figure emerged, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. My heart raced as I watched the figure move closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the fear had paralyzed me. The figure paused, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of Timothy's face, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural intensity. From that night on, the nocturnal visits became a regular occurrence. I would lie awake trembling as the figure moved about outside, sometimes lingering for hours on end. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the evidence was undeniable. As the weeks turned into months, the fear began to take its toll. I found myself jumpy and on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next encounter. I considered moving, but the thought of leaving my home, of abandoning it to the mercy of this unseen intruder, was too much to bear. One night, as I lay in bed, the familiar scratching sound at the window jolted me awake. This time, however, the figure did not linger. Instead, it moved with purpose, its movements deliberate and calculated. I watched, frozen in terror, as the figure pressed a key against the window, slowly working it back and forth until the lock clicked open. The window slid up and the figure stepped inside, its silhouette casting an ominous shadow across the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear had rendered me immobile. The figure moved closer, and as it stepped into the moonlight, I finally saw its face. It was Timothy, his eyes dark and hollow, a twisted grin spreading across his lips. From that moment on, my life became a living nightmare. Timothy would come and go as he pleased, sometimes staying for hours, other times disappearing for days on end. I lived in constant fear, never knowing when he might return, never knowing what he might do. As the days turned into weeks, the psychological toll became too much to bear. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest sound, unable to sleep for fear of what might happen during the night. The isolation was excruciating, as I became too afraid to even leave my own home. In the end, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something to take back control of my life. And so, one night, as Timothy crept in through the window, I waited, my heart pounding, until the perfect moment presented itself. And then, without a moment's hesitation, I struck. The aftermath was a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of sirens and flashing lights. But in the end, I was free from the torment, free from the fear that had consumed me. And as I sit here now, reflecting on the events of that fateful night, I can't help but wonder how many others have fallen victim to the predatory nature of their own neighbors, trapped in a living hell that only they can truly understand. It started with the whispers, faint, barely audible, but persistent nonetheless. At first I thought I was just imagining things, that the stress of my job and the demands of daily life were simply taking a toll on my mental well-being. But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew that I couldn't ignore them any longer. My neighbor, Sarah, had always been a bit of an odd one, keeping to herself and rarely venturing out of her modest townhouse. But as the whispers continued, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease whenever I saw her. Her eyes seemingly fixed on me, her lips moving in a silent murmur. One night as I lay in bed, the whispers grew so loud that I thought I might go mad. They seemed to be coming from everywhere, surrounding me, enveloping me in a cloak of dread. Panic rising in my chest, I threw on a robe and stepped out into the cool night air, determined to confront the source of this maddening phenomenon. As I approached Sarah's door, the whispers grew even louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to be calling out to me, beckoning me to come closer. With trembling hands, I knocked, and to my surprise, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Steeling my nerves, I stepped inside, the whispers now a deafening roar that threatened to overwhelm me. I could feel them pressing in on me, worming their way into my mind, whispering secrets and promises that I couldn't quite make sense of. And then, I saw her, Sarah, standing in the shadows, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural intensity. She moved closer, her movements fluid and graceful, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "They're calling to you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. "Can't you hear them?" I wanted to run, to flee from this madness, but something held me in place, a primal fear that seemed to grip me from the inside out. As Sarah drew closer, the whispers grew louder, a swirling, dissonant chorus that seemed to be pulling me deeper into a realm of darkness and despair. In that moment, I knew that I had to find a way to escape, to break free from the grip of this unseen force. But the more I struggled, the stronger the whispers became, until I could barely think, barely breathe. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself trapped in a waking nightmare, haunted by the relentless whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I tried to confide in friends and family, but they looked at me with a mix of pity and confusion, unable to understand the depths of my torment. And then, one night as I lay in bed, the whispers suddenly fell silent. In the eerie quiet, I heard a gentle tapping at my window, and when I turned to look, I saw Sarah, her face pressed against the glass, a twisted smile playing across her lips. In that moment, I knew that I would never be free, that the whispers would never truly leave me, that I was forever bound to the darkness that had consumed my neighbor. And as Sarah's laughter echoed in my mind, I felt a chill of resignation wash over me, knowing that my life would never be the same. It began with a subtle shift in the light, a flickering shadow that danced across the walls of my home, seemingly with a life of its own. At first, I brushed it off as mere imagination, the product of a tired mind and overactive senses. But as the days wore on, the shadow grew more persistent, more tangible, until I could no longer ignore its presence. My neighbor, Michael, had always been a bit of an enigma, a man who kept to himself and rarely engaged with the rest of the community. But as the shadow began to make its presence known, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease whenever I caught sight of him, his gaze seemingly fixed on me, a knowing smile playing across his lips. One night, as I lay in bed, the shadow suddenly appeared, its form shifting and contorting in the dim light. I watched, transfixed, as it danced across the room, seemingly taunting me, daring me to try and confront it. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, I realized that the shadow was not just a figment of my imagination, but something far more sinister. As I followed the shadow's movements, I began to notice a pattern, a strange and unsettling connection between its presence and the movements of my neighbor, Michael. Whenever the shadow would appear, Michael would be nowhere to be found, as if he had somehow merged with the darkness, becoming one with the very force that seemed to haunt my home. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself consumed by a growing sense of dread and fear. What was the nature of the connection between Michael and this haunting shadow? And why did it seem to be drawn to me, tormenting me with its very existence? As the days passed, the shadow grew bolder, its presence more persistent, until I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest movement or sound. I tried to confide in friends and family, but they looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism, unable to fully understand the depth of my torment. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, the shadow suddenly appeared, its form looming over me, its eyes burning with a malevolent intensity. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as the shadow seemed to reach out towards me, its tendrils of darkness wrapping around my limbs, holding me in place. In that moment, I felt a primal fear take hold, a sense of pure, unadulterated terror that threatened to consume me. And as the shadow drew closer, I caught a glimpse of Michael's face, his features contorted in a twisted, malevolent grin. From that day on, my life became a living hell, a constant battle against the haunting presence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I tried to escape, to leave my home and start anew, but the shadow always found me, always taunted me, always reminded me that I could never truly be free. And as I sit here now, haunted by the memory of that fateful night, I can't help but wonder how many others have fallen victim to the dark forces that lurk within the shadows, waiting to claim their own victims, to feed on their deepest fears and darkest secrets. For in the end, the true terror lies not in the shadow itself, but in the realization that we are all, in some way, connected to the darkness that dwells within us.